In the last presentation on professional honesty, we drew a distinction between the obligation merely not to lie, a negative duty, and the positive responsibility to tell the truth. We noted that a healthcare professional displays his or her honesty not simply by avoiding lying or deception, but by telling the truth to patients. We noted that the professional obligation to tell the truth or to inform their patients is grounded in the principles of autonomy, beneficence, and fidelity. By providing patients truthful information about their situations and the therapeutic interventions proposed, healthcare professionals enable patient self-determination as required by autonomy. They promote a patient's ability to maintain control over their own lives and their health care. We also noted that truthfulness in the professional relationship, or truthful management of information, promotes productive therapeutic relationships. That is to say, it maximizes the potential that a patient's interactions with healthcare professionals will actually make them better off, as the principle of beneficence requires. Finally, of course, and derivative of both autonomy and beneficence, is the idea that the professional-patient relationship is a trust-based one. Patients have a legitimate expectation that their caregivers be truthful and trustworthy. These are the kinds of considerations to which the principle of fidelity points. In this presentation, we want to consider an idea that profoundly shapes modern medical practice, an idea that gives specific expression to the professional obligation to be honest. We're talking here about the idea of voluntary informed consent, which is sometimes shortened to simply informed consent, or IC. Voluntary informed consent refers to the idea or the belief or the commitment to the idea that medical interventions are morally valid if and only if an informed patient or their authorized surrogate gives voluntary consent based on understanding of relevant information relevant to the medical decision being made. Otherwise, those medical interventions are an inappropriate violation of the patient's rights. Recognizing that medical interventions are often intrusive and often do harm to patients, some have said that medical interventions in the absence of voluntary informed consent are actually assaults that violate the principle of non-maleficence. To understand informed consent, or voluntary informed consent, consider its basic elements as identified by Post and Bluestein on page 34. The first requirement for voluntary informed consent to be met is patient decisional capacity. We will look much more carefully at what this requirement involves, but for the time being, you can think of it simply as an assumption about most adult patients, that they have decisional capacity. They have a capacity or an ability to make decisions about their health care. If they don't, of course, it's impossible for them to govern their own lives or exercise self-determination. And so the worry about voluntary informed consent makes no sense unless you have a patient with decisional capacity. Secondly, voluntary informed consent requires disclosure by physicians and other healthcare professionals of sufficient relevant information. Again, we will look in more detail at this requirement in the future, but the basic idea is that healthcare professionals have the responsibility to truthfully inform the patients of all that they need to know to make a good decision about their health care. But it's not enough simply that patients be informed. It's not enough simply that healthcare professionals tell patients or provide information to patients that they need. Rather, as well, they must assure that the patient understands what they've been told. They must communicate often complex and difficult medical information in a way that's understandable to patients who don't necessarily have and are very likely unlikely to have the biological and the medical knowledge to understand. This obligation to communicate difficult and often complex medical information in a way that patients understand is one of the most difficult challenges faced by healthcare professionals in meeting their obligations to patients. And it often falls upon nurses and others who spend more time with patients than physicians do. It often falls upon nurses to guarantee that patients do in fact understand. It may even fall upon nurses and others besides physicians to put information that physicians have communicated in a way that patients can understand. Surely it's often nurses who are in a position to truly verify whether patients do in fact understand the information that's been communicated to them. Fourth, voluntary informed consent, as the word voluntary implies, suggests that the decisions that patients make must be truly voluntary. There must be no compulsion or coercion. A patient's consent is valid only if that consent is truly their own, truly voluntary. If they are compelled or coerced by the physician or by a family member to agree to a treatment or withdrawal of treatment, then their consent isn't really valid. It isn't a true expression of their own wishes. It is not truly an expression of patient self-determination. Finally, patients must be able to communicate to us their consent or their refusal to treatment. This is pretty obvious. And usually, of course, if a patient is able to understand complex information and make decisions, they will also be able to communicate their decisions to us. Though it is possible, of course, to imagine a situation in which a patient does understand and does have a capacity to make a decision, but simply can't communicate it to us. This then introduces you to the concept of informed consent. In our next short presentation, we'll look at its basis in our moral values, including our principles, and look at some of the problems related to the practice of informed consent.